Welcome everybody to the meeting this morning. Welcome to all of those who've been here before, and also to those that haven't been before. The itinerary this morning is going to be a talk from Will Watson and Giles Kingsalter on aquatic invertebrates in Ice Age ponds. Firstly Will, and then another talk by a related talk on the end of that by Giles. And then after that, we'll be looking at the pond surveys, or the pond. We've got a database of ponds which have been located as part of the walking survey, as well as previous surveys. And we've done some prioritization to look at it based on the information that you've already given us. And we're going to be asking if there's any more information about those ponds that you haven't already sent in. So without further ado, I will ask Will to start his talk. And yes, if you wouldn't mind muting your mics during the talk, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We've split the presentation into two parts. This is because water beetles are by far the most numerous aquatic invertebrate within ponds. There are actually in terms of the groups, there's 350 species of water beetle in the United Kingdom. You'll probably know that beetles are the most numerous in terms of species group within globally. So that's perhaps not surprising. But of course, many of the beetles are adapted to life in water. So just look at some of the families now. There's 14 water beetle families. So although they all tend to be quite streamlined, the biggest family is predatory diving beetles, the Dytiscidae, which include the great diving beetles that you're probably familiar with. So all those beetles that sort of dart around underwater are in this group. And then there's obviously, I'm not showing all the families because we can go into greater detail if you want to later, but this is just a snapshot you can see. Hellophras. Actually, I've got a special association with this one because Hellophras are globally spread across the world in every single continent, obviously except Antarctica. And yeah, I found a species new to science. Well, I was just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And yeah, they all look quite sort of superficially alike. And we often come across Hellophras. They're very small, very tiny. The Hydrobius, well, they're screech or squeak beetles. And I'll show you, talk about that a little bit later. And then the Whirlygiggs, you're familiar with those that sort of skate around on the surface of water. And there's quite a few species of those as well, but they, being streamlined, they all look superficially alike, so you have to sort of look in finer detail if you want to identify the actual species, where there's often subtle characteristics that tell them apart. Hydrophilidae, this is a great silver diving beetle. Sadly, we don't have any in Herefordshire, but we've got sort of related families that are present. Of course, there's always the minor possibility that something like that will turn up. That's simply because we're between sort of locations, and sometime after the Ice Age, they probably were present in ponds elsewhere. So yeah, the Hellophras beetles, they're a very large group actually, and this is one of the sort of water beetles that don't swim. They're known as scavenger water beetles because they sort of scavenge, but they crawl around on vegetation. Some of them are some of them are sort of are weak swimmers, but they don't use their feet to propel them in you know, fast, so they can sort of move around a bit, some of them. But anyway, let's move on and look at this is a great diving beetle. It's got the grooves on the back, so we know this is a female. These are one of the beetles that they've got sexual dimorphism, so you know the difference between males and females. There are other beetles like this as well, where but it's often the grooves are the giveaway. So that's even something that a basic someone with a bit of skill can learn about. And there are quite a few. Let's move on to the next slide. There's quite a few different species, and as I said, they often show these are not so subtle characteristics. Actually, you notice these. I think some people have called them chevrons. They're sort of black and then you've got this light sort of I don't know, horn coloured between. So you can see the black there, and that one doesn't have it. That's because they're two different species. This is the that's the standard great diving beetle, Dytiscus marginalis, and this is Dytiscus circumflexus. But by and large, this is the sort of techniques that we use. I think there's about 8 different species, of which 4 are found in Herefordshire, one of which is extremely rare. The others turn up from time to time, but most of them are excuse me, most of them are the ordinary great diving beetle, Dytiscus marginalis. All beetles go through the same stages, like butterflies. So they've got the larval stage, and they've got a pupa as well, and then they develop into the adult. Of course, the great crested newt, the great diving beetle larvae are extremely voracious, and you can see it. There's one that is feeding on a unfortunate frog tadpole there, and that there on the left of the picture, for comparison, is a dragonfly larva. You can see they're roughly the same size, but very, very different in shape. This might be worth just pointing out while we've got the two together, some of the differences, so that you've got on the dragonfly, you have the mask here around the head, whereas you've got these enormous jaws on the water beetle larva, and then the breathing tubes at the back. You generally got two different protrusions here. Okay, and just move on to look at some of the other diving beetles. This is the lesser silver diving beetle. I put this in here because it's actually quite common, again, there's difference between males and females. So the one on the left is the male, and the one on the right is the female with the grooves. So that you're not looking at 2 different species, you're actually looking at males and females. And there's actually, if you look at the patination there, if you compare it to some of the books that are available, you won't confuse it with any other species, because there's not so many that size. It's an intermediate size. I should have said that the great diving beetle is well over an inch. You probably know that, most of you. And this is somewhat smaller, but again is very common. The other characteristic, the other useful thing about this is that this species is that its larva is very characteristic, because it's got this narrow head here, and it's got a narrow head, and it's got a narrow neck as well, and its movement is very sort of undulating through the water, and you can pick these things out very easily. So when you go pond dipping, you'll be able to say, oh yeah, that's the lesser silver diving beetle larva. Hopefully, you'll see some of these as well. So, and then a few other Dytiscidae species. This is very characteristic again. This is known as the cherry stone beetle. That's because it's meant to look. Put it this way: it's meant to look like a cherry stone. But I had a colleague and he called it the lentil beetle. And in terms of scale, it's far more like a lentil than it is like a cherry stone. So, okay. Again, we should find those. You'll probably find those at Moccas if any of you are going to the lawn pool at Moccas next week. Now, this is an Agabus. There's lots of Agabus in this predatory diving beetle grouping, the family. But this is a special one. It's special to Herefordshire because we found it at Blakeney, and it was the I think it was the first. There is a dot that's close by, but I think it might relate to Worcestershire from like 100 years ago or something. But anyway, the nearest known locality for this species is over 100 kilometres away in Cambridgeshire. So it can be sort of reliably called a glacial relic, really, because we know that it's been isolated from the other population and it's found within a kettle hole pond, and it's very rare to find a sort of rare species these days because there are so many people looking, basically. So yeah, that was a feather in our caps to find that. I said I'd mentioned the Squeak Beetle. This is an enlargement of the previous photograph. There's only actually one species of Squeak Beetle in Britain. So when you see these things, you don't have to confuse it with, it's not going to be confused with any other species. And as the name suggests, when you pick them up, they squeak. So, if we find one at Moccas, we'll try and demonstrate to you. So there's another incentive for you to go. Whirlygiggs, again, a big family, and they, as I said, they skate around on the ponds, and they've got two different. They're very unusual eye structure, which is kind of, I think, is unique. It's got eyes on top and it's got eyes underneath. So they've got these sort of four eye structures, really. So they look up, so they can see up, they can see above, and they can see below. So it's quite remarkable, really. Looking at some of the other, these are the I mentioned about scavenger water beetles, and these are the things that sort of crawl around generally. Well, this photo came out really well. This was taken under the microscope and it was stacked as well. So both Giles and I have got these fantastic microscopes that we use, and we can attach our cameras on top and take these incredibly detailed photographs, which shows punctures. You can see, you can imagine what I mean by punctures. So it's these little dots that are going in parallel lines along the, we call this the elytra, the wing case, okay? That's one of the ways we use to distinguish between different species, is the size of well, it can be the size, it can be how close they are together, and that sort of thing. So you're kind of looking at really subtle characteristics, and maybe the shape of the antennae, and the Agabus here. This is the sort of, this is a male, so, okay. But the shape of these are the reason is that they're lock and key mechanism, so that the male, so that they, that they basically have a different shaped key between the species. So, it's obvious, really, isn't it? And very clever. So that's one of the ways we can distinguish between different species. This is Hydrobius, which is actually a very common scavenger water beetle, and it's black, very dark. But there's three different. We now know there's at least three different species, which got really subtle characteristics. So, but you notice that we've got a bit of air being trapped underneath here as well. So that's the way they breathe, and then they crawl around on the vegetation. They're quite small, these ones, and the photo, that's why the photo's not brilliant, but We're always working to improve on that, of course. And this is the other one that traps air underneath. This is the great silver diving beetle. And in some books they say, oh yeah, this is the largest beetle in Britain. Certainly if you exclude the male stag beetle, it is. They're really quite, you know, well over, well, I think they're nearly 2 inches long. Massive, beautiful things. We'd love to find them in Herefordshire. I think the nearest place might be Somerset Levels. But if you've got a really good range of habitats, that's where you start thinking, oh yeah, the habitats seems right, maybe I'll find it there. So yeah, if you guys are going out and you're finding these groups of ponds and ditches and all sorts of things like that, that's the sort of habitat we want. This is the Hellophras Beetle. There's lots of these, and they all look quite similar, but these ones vary in size a lot. So you get very tiny ones and then you get bigger ones. Now this isn't technically a water beetle. It's what's often called an honorary water beetle, because it doesn't spend all of its life cycle in the pond. It actually spends its larva stage in the pond. And these are reed beetles, and this one's Dinaceus simplex, which is the most common one, I think, in the UK, and the most common one species in Britain. Sorry, in Herefordshire, and it generally feeds on branched burr reed. So that's it actually on branched burr reed. So wherever you find branched burr reed, you start looking for them, and they're very pretty. This is not the most pretty of the species, because sometimes they have iridescence that's red, blue, golden. So they can be stunningly beautiful. I haven't shown one of the stunningly beautiful ones because I don't think we found them in Herefordshire. You know, that's some of the other species. So there's quite a lot of these, I think 20 odd species. I'm just going to end with a little bit about surveying. This is on the right, it's Professor Garth Foster, and he's running a course in Herefordshire. This is a course we ran at Hampton Court. And just to point out some of the techniques, so he's used his pond net and he's shoved basically he's using the pond net to gather up the vegetation around the edge, sort of shuffling it around, and then you put it in the tray and out come the water beetles. And you can see he's putting them in the pot to take back home, because not even he can identify them in the field. And he's the national expert, if not one of the world, well, he's certainly one of the world's national experts as well. And another photograph, we took Professor Garth Foster down to the Sturts, and this is one of the ponds here that's got this wonderful profile. You want these ponds to have these shallow sloping sides. I think, as we've said in previous presentations, this is because, you know, it's nice and warm. This is the warmest part. This is where all the pond life develops. And it also can evade predation if it gets in the real shallows. So you get more ranges of aquatic invertebrates in the shallows than anywhere else. This is example, I'm going to rush through these probably a bit. This is an example of good quality pond because it's got all the zones of vegetation. I may have shown you this before, but it's worth showing you again. So it's got emergent, floating and submerged vegetation. This is at Waterloo in the Sturts, Sturts East, I think it's known as. This is another pond in the Sturts, very ephemeral, but that doesn't discount the wildlife potential of the site. It's got great, these tiny ephemeral ponds have still got great potential. Because they're shallow and they support, it's unimproved, it's not sprayed, the water quality is good, so it supports a very wide range of species. What we tend to do with beetles, I mean, I know this is a bit like butterfly collecting, but it has a greater purpose. That's simply because that we need reference collections, because they're basically, water beetles are very streamlined and it's very difficult to tell them apart. So it helps to have a reference collection. whereas there's probably less justification with butterflies. But certainly with water beetles, it's very helpful. And then you can also, if you label them correctly, it tells you, it gives you the history of where they were at certain periods and times. This is from the collection in the Hereford Museum, so they have some quite important collections there. This is the records that I gathered. Well, this is my list, but it's mainly got a lot of Garth Foster's determination and some of his own records, because obviously he came there as well. But this was the list I compiled for the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, and you can see what a jolly good site it is, with I don't know, 30 or so species from these ponds. Really good. And you can see all the notable and some of the red data book. RDB means red data book. You can see some of those, so that means they're really good. This is a very rare one. RUC, I don't know, I was wondering if it is actually in danger, but anyway, it's a red data book 3. This is technically our rarest beetle in Herefordshire. You see it's very similar to the other one. And this is the write-up about it. You don't have to, you see Mockers Park, it's where it used to be. And then it's also Mockers Park, and it's in the same 1 kilometre square actually, because the Sturts is opposite. So it's opposite Mockers Park to the north. So yeah. Poor quality ponds don't provide many water beetles at all. I mean, that's probably fairly obvious. No emergent vegetation, no submerged, no aquatic vegetation whatsoever. And then this other bottom slide just shows what the average pond might look like, where you tend to have often just submerged vegetation, but it's still pretty good. But it's been compromised to a certain extent. So you're going to get very few water beetles. You'd be lucky to get 1 water beetle in that other pond. In fact, I do remember I only got aquatic bugs in that top pond. But this would be an example of one of the more common water beetles that you might find, Colyumbetes fuscus. But it's a medium-sized beetle, so you know it's pretty attractive. Although it's common, it's a nice beetle to find, and one you might be able to identify in the field. Just to end, there aren't that many books on water beetles themselves, but I think you can still get John T. Denton's book on the water bugs and water beetles of Surrey. It's actually a very good book, and a lot of what's found in Surrey is also found in Herefordshire. And then there's a specialist book, well, it's not that technical actually, but it's quite an interesting read by Peter Sutton on the larger water beetles of the British Isles. And I'm done now, so I don't know if you want to ask questions now or just carry on with Giles's talk. I don't know, it's up to you. If David wants to.
If there are any brief questions now, perhaps you could ask Will while Giles is sharing his screen.
Will, can you just clarify how big a small beetle, a medium-sized beetle, and a large beetle is?
Oh gosh.
I mean, you don't have to be exact.
Put me on the spot there. Well, as I said, I think the great diving beetle and the silver diving beetles are over an inch, you know, about 1.5 inches, a maximum, and the smaller water beetle, Colyumbetes fuscus, is about 1/2 inch. You don't mind me using inches, do you? Because it sounds better for water beetles. But and then some of the other ones, now I'm going to millimeters, you know, are a couple of millimeters. In fact, they get down to much smaller. I probably didn't give you the reason I didn't give you the example of the very smallest ones is I don't have good photographs of them yet. We're still taking photographs under the microscope, and we did find the very smallest diving beetle in Britain. Well, I found it, and then great Garth Foster confirmed it. Am I allowed to say where we found it? Well, it was near Prestine, but not in a kettle hole pond. and that was I think just over a millimeter. It's under 2 millimeters anyway.
Yeah,
so they can be very, very tiny.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And
you need your glasses. I need my glasses anyway. So
that very large one, Will, what was that one? The 2 inches one?
The silver diving beetle.
Silver diving beetle. That sounded quite spectacular. Okay, well, shall we go on to Giles's talk now? If you'd like to share your
There's a question from Selena as well.
Oh, sorry.
Who asked, are the beetles mainly carnivorous?
Ah.
Right. What's the question? Sorry. Is it in the chat room?
Are the beetles mainly carnivorous, or water beetles?
Yes, the predatory diving beetles all are carnivorous, but the scavenger water beetles, some of those feed on sort of rotting vegetation or either rotting or vegetation, aquatic vegetation. So so I mean that's basically it, but there are always exceptions, so I mean the silver diving beetle is a vegetarian, but it's not a predatory diving beetle. So the predatory diving beetles are all carnivorous. So yeah. I don't know what it might be 60-40, that sort of thing. So 60% of them are carnivorous and 40% are sort of vegetarian diet.
That sounds.
Is that a very general thing? Yeah, I think that sort of explains it. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Giles, if you're ready.
Okay, I'll make a start. So I'm going to essentially go through a number of the other groups of aquatic invertebrates apart from the beetles. So it's not going to be completely comprehensive because it depends what I had photos for partly, but it should go through quite a good range of different species. So make a start. Obviously, a major group of invertebrates we're talking about will be insects. So I'm going to cover insects first, and then at the end, after that, I'll move on to some of the other groups. So starting with dragonflies, these are obviously quite familiar. So this is an adult four-spotted chaser. This is one of the species you could well see around Herefordshire. It's quite a common species. And this is one of the species that tends to emerge quite early in the year. So probably around May, maybe even April is when you'll see these start to emerge. And then one of the hawker species, the common hawker, which in Herefordshire isn't really very well named because it's actually one of the least common species here. So this is a female. Actually, one of the distinctive features of this species is the yellow margin at the front of the wing, which identifies it quite clearly. So you can see here this female is egg laying. So they lay their eggs into aquatic vegetation. Often there'll be things like decaying stems or leaves, which I think is what she's using here. And then after some time, the eggs will hatch out and you get these distinctive dragonfly larvae, which normally in most species would probably take around 2 years in the pond to develop to full size. So, and the shape of these can vary quite a bit depending on the group of species. So for these hawker larvae, similar to the previous one, as you remember, the adults are quite long-bodied and the larvae are also quite elongated as well. So on the head, you can see these very large eyes. So these are very active predatory insects and feed on all sorts of pond life, tadpoles, newt larvae, all sorts of things. But some of the other species, the larvae would be rather squatter, not so much of an elongated abdomen. So the chasers, for instance, they tend to just sit around half buried in the mud, just waiting for creatures to come past, and then they can then grab them. And then obviously the relatives of the dragonflies, the damselflies. So large-head damselfly. This is almost invariably the first one you're going to see in the spring. So these will be emerging quite soon now. I'd say probably April, because these overwinter as full-size larvae. So as soon as the weather has warmed up sufficiently in the spring, these are the first ones to emerge. And so obviously the difference with the dragonflies is that typically the damselflies, they fold their wings back like this, and they're altogether much more delicate insects. But like dragonflies, they're also predatory, although they tend to be taking insects more from the vegetation rather than catching them in flight as the dragonflies do. And you see these are the azure damselflies. Again, one of the very common species, probably the commonest blue damselfly that you'll see, especially around smaller ponds. And for mating and egg laying, they tend to pair up like this. So you've got the males on top holding the female sort of by the neck, and then the females are then egg laying into the aquatic vegetation. So in some months you can often see quite a number of pairs around particular ponds. And this is one of the small red-eyed damselfly. This is a species that's, I think, only colonized Britain about 20 years ago, and then underwent quite a rapid expansion in range. And so Will photographed these in Herefordshire a few years ago I think this might have been at one of the Kenchester ponds, and they tend to sit around on these floating mats of vegetation or algae out in the middle of the pond. So again, blue damselflies with these very bright red eyes, and the damselfly larvae, again, generally similar to dragonflies, but much more delicate. And they have these three broad sort of plates at the back, which function as gills, although occasionally they can actually lose these, and it doesn't seem to do them too much damage, so they're not absolutely essential. So again, these will develop anything. I think typically these would have a 1-year life cycle. So the eggs laid 1 year will be emerging as adults in the following season. And then on to other groups. So bugs, these are one of the other major groups of aquatic species. So there are quite a lot of water bugs, and there's several groups which are associated with the water surface. So pond skaters are the most familiar. So as you can see, like all the insects, they've got 3 pairs of legs. So the middle and the hind pair are very elongated, which they use to skate over the surface. And then the front pair, much shorter, and they use these to help grab prey items. And then you can also see they have quite a long beak, which they will kind of stab the prey and then feed on it in a sort of liquid form. So this is it's about a centimetre or so long. So there's a number of different species of pond skaters, but they're all generally fairly similar looking. And then a related group, a different family, these are the water crickets. So similar idea, but rather different body shape, and called crickets because they do look a bit like a cricket, although obviously not at all related. So you often find these in rather shaded ponds, streams as well, and their sort of skating style is rather different to the pond skaters. So once you learn to recognize these are quite easy to pick out. And then another similar one, the water measurer. This is the one that looks a bit like a tiny stick insect, although it's not at all related. This is also a bug. I think this is often said to be one of the narrowest insects in Britain in relation to its length. So extremely elongated, and even its head at the front, so probably about 1/3 of its length is made up of its head. And you can see the eyes towards the front, very long legs, very long antennae. So these don't really skate over the water, these walk or run. And again, they'll be feeding on small insects and things like they can pick up on the water surface. So, but often you'll find these more skulking around the vegetation rather than skating out in the middle of open water. So, and then under the water, these are still talking about aquatic bugs here. So the These are the water boatmen or the back swimmers. So we've got 4 species of these in Britain, and they all swim upside down like this. So again, so the back legs are modified into these very long swimming legs with swimming hairs, and then the middle and the front legs, again, they're used for grabbing onto prey, and they have a beak at the front which they use to suck the juice out of the prey. And so if you ever handle these, you should be quite careful because they can give you quite a painful bite. So I don't recommend doing that. So these will feed a lot on prey that they catch at the water surface. So even things like the damselflies we saw egg laying on one of the previous slides, sometimes when the female is quite sort of underwater with her abdomen trying to find a good egg laying spot, she's vulnerable to being attacked by a whole group of these water boatmen, which can happen occasionally. And then similar, but these are the lesser water boatmen in the family Cryxidae. So these again have the elongated back legs, but they sort of swim upside down. These swim more the right way up, and they will so quite a range of different species of these. Its sizes range probably between about 3 or 4 millimeters at the low end up to around 14 or so, the bigger ones. So yes, and these don't tend to be as predatory as the back swimmers. So they often feed more on, actually got quite a varied diet. So some will feed more on detritus or decaying material or plant material, or some will feed on animals like small worms and things. So depending on the species. And other, yes, and one of the other aquatic bugs, again, actually, this is another one with a painful bite. This is the saucer bug. So superficially, it looks very like one of the water beetles, but actually it doesn't have those hard wing cases like a beetle. It has these, the wings are actually quite soft and squishy. So if you ever pick these up, you'll find they can be squashed quite easily if you're not careful. Whereas the beetles are very robust. And the white things all over its back, they're not actually part of it. These will be small ciliate protozoans, which are just attach themselves to it. It's probably because this is quite an old individual. I'd say this is probably one that's overwintered. So because it's so old, it's been a lot of time for these ciliates to attach onto it. And so it's something you can see with older beetles as well. And all these bugs, like the beetles, actually, they can mostly they can fly. So they've all got well-developed wings. So they're very capable of dispersing from pond to pond. And especially on warm days, often you can see these things climbing out of the water, and they'll just fly off quite readily. Now, alderfly. So this is an adult, obviously. This is one of the more primitive groups of insects. You can see the wings have got a lot of veins. So more advanced groups of insects tend to have wings with reduced venation. But like the dragonflies, these alderflies have very sort of rather primitive wing structure. And I don't unfortunately have a picture of the larvae of these, but the larvae somewhat similar to the beetle larvae. They carnivorous and they develop underwater. So you've got 3 different species of these, which are quite similar. But there's really only one species you tend to get associated with the ponds. And then mayflies. Again, so the adult mayflies you're probably all familiar with, especially down by the rivers. But there's one species, the pond olive, which you very, very commonly get. Very commonly get in small ponds. So the larvae, very distinctive. They've got these 3 tails with sort of bristles sticking off them. These on this individual, they got slightly damaged actually. And then along the sides of the abdomen, you've got these gills, which are these kind of leaf-like structures. And if you ever get the chance to watch these, they actually will flutter the gills quite rapidly to improve the flow of water over them, because these do require quite well oxygenated conditions. So most mayflies you tend to get in running water, like in rivers, especially in the kind of gravelly sections where you've got well oxygenated riffle areas. But this species is pond associated, and especially in a new pond you can get very large numbers of these, so quite distinctive. And then caddisflies. So caddisflies are actually quite related to moths, and you can see the adults do look quite moth-like, except where moths and butterflies, their wings are covered in scales. In caddisflies, they're covered in hairs instead of scales. And the scientific name Trichoptera actually means sort of hairy wings. And one of the distinctive things about these is that they have these very long antennae, which they hold straight out to the front. So as moths, often the antennae will be folded back along the body or held at a different angle, but not straight out in this way. And you can actually, if anyone does any moth trapping, you can often get quite a few caddisflies will come to the moth trap lights as well. And then, so there's actually one terrestrial species in Britain, the land caddis, which you get in Worcestershire, but all the other species are aquatic, and the larvae tend to live in ponds or sometimes in rivers and streams. And most species, not all of them, but most of them, the larvae construct these cases out of bits of plant material or bits of stones, or they even incorporate things like snails. And the kind of case they produce depends on the species. And often you can get quite a long way towards distinguishing the different species depending on the structure of the case. And so these will typically develop over a year. So you tend to get the mature larvae around now in the springtime, and then shortly they'll be pupating and emerging as adults. So this is the second species of caddis. You see, it forms a rather different case. This is made out of leaf fragments. So the case is rather broad and flat, so quite different to the previous species. And these larvae will tend to feed mainly on kind of plant detritus that you'll find lying around in the pond. So often where you've got ponds with a lot of fallen leaves from perhaps some trees around, you can get very large numbers of these caddis species. And so these also have gills, except you can't see them because they're, again, along the body, but they'll normally be hidden inside the case. So quite an elongated body towards the rear. And as I said, caddis are related to moths. Now, you don't really associate moths with ponds, but there are a small number of exceptions, and this is one. This is the brown China mark moth, which is one you might see around the waterside vegetation. It's quite a distinctive species with these brown and white markings. And you can see the antennae, it's holding back along the body, not stretched out as in a caddisfly. And the caterpillar, this actually makes itself a little case made out of a leaf fragment, which it cuts. So this is it here, slightly enlarged for you. So you can just see the head of the caterpillar poking out. So it'll actually, so it feeds mainly on broadleaf pondweed, which is quite a common species. And in this case, it's able to float around the surface of the water, just feeding on the plants. So you can identify this species both from the adult moth and also from the caterpillar. If you see these little cases, they're normally around maybe 1 centimetre long, something like that. And you can also see the feeding damage on the leaves. Okay, then on to some of the flies. So there are a lot of flies that breed in water, which only can cover a small number of them. So this is one of the distinctive examples, the rat-tailed maggot, which isn't particularly associated with ponds as such. It tends to be more associated with stagnant water with very high levels of organic pollution, where the oxygen levels tend to be very low. And at the back, they have these very long breathing tube, which is how they get their name, which acts like a snorkel. So the body of the maggot can be sometimes a number of centimeters below the water, but it's still able to reach the surface and breathe through this extended tail. So you don't tend to get them in ponds because they're quite vulnerable to being eaten by predators. So they just are associated with these very polluted, normally very small water bodies, where you don't get any other species, but you can get very large numbers of these building up. And then this is an example of one of the adult flies. So these are hoverflies, quite familiar flies. So sort of fairly large and distinctive flies. And a couple of other groups of flies here. So the large maggoty thing in the middle is actually a cranefly larva. So quite a lot of species of cranefly, and some of them are terrestrial and feed on plant roots, like the familiar leather jackets you might get in your lawn. But then there are also quite a lot of aquatic species as well. So these don't really swim, they just wriggle about, and you tend to find these in the shallow, well-vegetated edges of ponds or streams. And then around it, these much smaller things are actually black fly larvae. So these are biting flies, but they're not really pond associated. These are more associated with well-oxygenated running water. So streams or weirs or waterfalls, especially the kind of riffle type stretches of streams. So we can get these in very large numbers, but not really a pond group of species. And then chironomid midges, or non-biting midges, these are one of the probably most diverse groups of aquatic species we have in Britain. Not sure how many species there are, but it's a very large number. And so the larvae of these are aquatic, and some of them, not all of them, but some of them are known as bloodworms because they contain hemoglobin, which gives them this red color, which allows them to live in quite low oxygenated environments. So this allows them to cope with lack of oxygen, because obviously hemoglobin that's what it does, it binds to oxygen. So so often you can see big clouds of these adult midges above the ponds in the spring and summer. And then on to some of the non-insect groups now. So this is one of the pirate wolf spiders. So this is quite a common species. You'll see it at a lot of ponds, probably the majority of ponds, I'd have thought, around Herefordshire. It's a species of wolf spider. So I think its body's perhaps just under a centimetre long. And these are quite active spiders. They run around over the surface and tend to spend a lot of time also around the plants, either around the edge or the floating vegetation. There's about half a dozen different species, but this is by far the commonest one. And then on to a rather more impressive spider, which unfortunately we don't get in Herefordshire. This was up in the Shropshire Wales border. So this is the raft spider, which is a much larger species, also associated with the water surface. Yes, unfortunately, we're not very likely to see any of these at our Ice Age ponds, although it would be quite good to find it. And then water snails. So you've got another pond olive larva there as well. So with snails, you've got quite a lot of different species that actually live in water and in ponds from a number of different families. So this is one of the pond snails, and these are actually air-breathing snails, so they'll come to the surface for oxygen. And they tend to have these rather pointed shells. So I expect a lot of you have seen this species because it is one of the commonest ones. And then a couple of other families of snails on the right. We have this ramshorn. So there are quite a number of different ramshorn species in Britain. They range in size from the great ramshorn, which is it's about 2 to 3 centimeters across, and at the other end you have very small ones, maybe only 2 millimeters across. And this is one of the margin ramshorn, the kind of intermediate one, perhaps the range of a centimeter or so. And then on the left, the bladder snail. So we actually have a native species of bladder snail, and then at least two, maybe more species which have been introduced from the Americas, of which this is one of them. So can't really see this from the photo, but the shell spiral actually goes in the other direction. In the pond snails, if you look at the shell face on, the opening is on the right-hand side, whereas in the bladder snails, it's on the left. So it spirals the other way. And then mussels. So quite a range of different mussel species. This is the largest one you like to see in a pond. It's the swan mussel, can get up to maybe 15 centimeters long or so. What's this one? It's probably about 11. And where these occur, you can often find the dead shells kind of washed up on the edge of the shore, or maybe piled up if the pond has been dredged at all. So these tend to be associated more with larger lakes, like fishing pools, rather than small ponds. And then at the other end of the scale, we have pea mussels, which are extremely small, maybe 2-3 millimeters across, and quite a lot of different species. These are pretty common in ponds, so you can often find these ones, but quite hard to identify because the species do tend to look fairly similar. And then on to leeches. This is a horse leech. This is quite a large, impressive sized leech, but quite a common species. And the reason it's called a horse leech is because it looks quite similar to the much rarer medicinal leech. So when people were collecting leeches for medicine, this was the leech they didn't want, or maybe they could try and pass it off as a medicinal leech. Because this isn't a blood-sucking species, they tend to feed on smaller animals which they'll just suck in whole. So not one of the parasitic blood-sucking leeches. And another small species, this is a very common leech in ponds, epidera. So normal size, probably about 3 centimeters long. You see it's got a sucker at the rear end, not much of a sucker at the front end. And these, again, these aren't blood-sucking leeches. They are feeding on small invertebrates, things like worms and fly larvae. And it's quite a familiar species. And then flatworms. So these are rather more primitive group of worms. They're not segmented like earthworms and leeches. They tend to move. They just glide over the surface using cilia rather than swimming by muscular contractions. So it's rather unclear in this photo, but this species actually has a large number of eyes, which are all distributed around the front and the side margins of the head, which is on the top left. But again, there's quite a few species of flatworm, which is not always easy to tell apart. And okay, finally, crustaceans. So it's rather short of crustacean photos. So we have this waterhotglass here, which is one of the relatives of the woodlice, and has a pretty similar lifestyle except underwater. So they tend to feed on decaying leaf material. So in ponds with a lot of organic material, you can get very large numbers of these building up. And I think that is the end. I didn't have any shrimp photos, unfortunately, which would have been quite useful.
That's excellent. Thank you, Giles. That was really excellent, fascinating and brilliant photographs by yourself and Will. Quite a variety there.